Okay, today we're going to talk about pop art. So pop art is an art movement that emerged in the United Kingdom and in the United States in the mid to late 1950s. The movement presented a challenge to traditions of art by including imagery from popular culture and mass-produced mass media culture like comic books and advertising and just mundane, mass-produced cultural objects, artifacts. So it kind of, I generally look at it in two parts, the British side and the American side. So the intention behind the British pop art movement that came together in London in the 1950s and was known as the independent group, or IG, the independent group. So their intention was to challenge current artistic conventions and to focus more on a found art style, basically. So they wanted to treat cultural objects just as they were and didn't really seek to stylize and elevate them to a fine arts level so much. They didn't want to put them in any particular kind of cultural lens. So these artists receive their inspiration from different forms of mass media, again, like comic books, like advertisements, movies, magazines, that kind of thing. And that's the basis of the art, okay? So some of the proto-pop art that existed in Europe in the 1940s predated the independent group, but they were kind of the first to truly incorporate what would eventually come to be known as pop art. And they tended to focus particularly on American mass media culture. So even the British group, the independent group, still kind of focused on American mass media and advertisement as their main source of inspiration. And there was a big difference between the British pop art and the later American pop art, which would emerge mostly in New York and included, like, Andy Warhol is the most obvious example. For one, the British artists viewed the American commercialism that they were parodying through a completely different perspective, right? They're not surrounded by it constantly the same way that the Americans were. Some of the most important painters in the British movement were Eduardo Palazzi. He's also a sculptor, and he's a visual artist, and he's a printmaker. Surrealist artist Tony Del Renzio is pretty prominent in the British movement, and then Richard Hamilton, who we'll talk about next. So we'll go ahead and pull Richard Hamilton up. All of these artists were members of the independent group, and they met on a regular basis at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which was in London. Again, this is during the 50s. Palazzi, in particular, is generally credited with producing the first true pop art work, which was a collage that was called I Was a Rich Man's Plaything, and he makes this in 1947. So we're not going to look at that particular piece, but it's kind of largely considered the first true pop art. So that's kind of an origin. Another example from this time is this work, which is a little later, obviously, but this one's kind of the first work of true pop art that was really widely viewed, okay? So this is Richard Hamilton's, and it's the collage, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? And it was in an exhibition called This Is Tomorrow, which was a big exhibition in London and kind of the first pop art exhibition. Some of the London-based artists, like Billy Apple, for example, who's actually, I think, Australian? Maybe he's from New Zealand. He's not originally from London. I think he's maybe from New Zealand. Anyway, he eventually travels overseas and becomes really involved in the American pop art movement and collaborated with American pop art makers, or American pop artists like, in Billy's case, Andy Warhol. Okay, so prominent American artists, we have Andy Warhol, we have Robert Rauschenberg, we have Jasper Johns, and one of the American pop movement's aims was to use images of popular, right, thus pop, popular culture as opposed to elitist or high art or fine art culture, and use that in art. So emphasizing the banal or the kitschy kind of elements of culture. So you can think about this in direct contradiction and kind of as butting heads with Greenbergian modernism, right? We looked at that essay by Clement Greenberg when we talked about abstract expressionism that was about the difference between the avant-garde and Kitsch. So the pop artists come along and they're like, actually, we think Kitsch is the avant-garde, is going to be the new avant-garde, basically. So they want to really emphasize that aspect, kind of the lowbrow aspect of the cultural items, objects, and things that they're drawing inspiration from. So they're often using irony here. That's one of their kind of tools. Pop art is also associated with the artist's use of mechanical means of reproduction. So like rendering techniques. In pop art, material sometimes visually removed from its known context and isolated or combined with an unrelated material, and often things that can be duplicated through screen printing. Silk screen and screen printing becomes a big methodology that's used by artists at this time, particularly Warhol, particularly Rauschenberg. Okay, so although British and American pop art both kind of emerge mostly in the 1950s, we have some European artists who have direct links that are kind of the lineage of this that are making work earlier that's sort of similar and sort of leads into pop art. And that would be Marcel Duchamp, Francis Picabia, and Man Ray. They all predate the movement, and in addition, there's some early American proto-pop origins which utilized kind of found art cultural objects. Okay, the term pop art is officially introduced in December of 1962, and the occasion is this event that's organized by the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA in New York, and it is called the Symposium on Pop Art. So that's the first time we actually see this phrasing. By this time, American advertising had adopted many elements of modern art and was kind of functioning at a sophisticated level. So fine art or high art had kind of been co-opted by advertising. So now people who are making pop art are kind of co-opting advertising language and calling that art. So it's sort of subversive in its origins. So basically, consequently, American artists had to search deeper for dramatic styles that would distance art from the well-designed and clever commercial materials. As the British viewed American popular culture imagery from a somewhat removed perspective, their views were often instilled with kind of a romantic, sentimental, humorous overtone. In contrast, American artists bombarded every day with all the ton of mass-produced imagery tend to produce work that's more bold and aggressive, with some exceptions. Claus Oldenburg is a little bit more humor-based in some of his work. Okay, so pop art. That is where we are at. Let's look at this. So this is Richard Hamilton. He's British. He is born in 1922. He dies in 2011. And he trains originally as an engineering draftsman, so he has a technical drawing background. He studied the way advertising shaped attitudes, and that's kind of the focus of all of his work. He comes at this from a very advertising-oriented background and perspective. He combined elements of pop culture and fine art and saw them as equally important forms of visual communication. And that's kind of the basis of a lot of pop art on either side of the pond, the British or the American, is the idea that fine art and commercial advertising are equal in terms of visual communication, and there isn't really one that's more important than the other. And that's one of the things. It's kind of about democratizing. So democratizing visual culture, bringing everything to the same level. Okay. So this is Eduardo Palazzi. He is born in 1924. He dies in 2005. So he's kind of Hamilton's Scottish counterpart in a lot of ways. So he is born in Scotland. His parents are Italian immigrants. He's born in Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland. So, like most Italian men, and this is kind of an ugly part of history, he's put in an internment camp. Okay, so in 1940, most Italian men who were living in Scotland, when Scotland becomes part of the UK, because of World War II, as you know, the Italians were allied with Germany and Japan, right, in World War II. So if you happen to be of Italian heritage, when Scotland joined Britain and joined the UK, you were put in an internment camp, and a lot of people were actually kind of sent away. So he's put, unfortunately, in an internment camp during this time because his parents were Italian immigrants. And then, very tragically, his father, his grandfather, and his uncles are put on a ship that is sending them to Canada, and that ship is destroyed by a German U-boat, and they all drown, which is horrible. So he has this very tragic, rough start. But he goes to Edinburgh College of Art in 1943, and then he goes for graduate school to the Slade School of Art at the University College in London. And after that, he moves to Paris, and when he's in Paris, he starts hanging out with George Braque, so the co-founder of Cubism, and also with Constantine Brancusi, the wonderful sculptor, and Jean Arp, one of the founders of Dada, and Alberto Giacometti, who's the sculptor who was he was really big in post-war expressionism in Europe. So Palazzi is mostly remembered as a sculptor. All of his early work is sculpture. He's very influenced by Giacometti. But his highly innovative graphic work, like this from the 60s and 70s, is what really stands out as his contribution to pop to me. So he really extends and explores silkscreen as a methodology for fine art and high art production. And he's one of the earlier people to do that. And that becomes a strategy and a technique that's used in pop art, in both British pop art and American pop art, pretty heavily. So I think that that's one of the things to really recognize him for, because he was one of the first people to really explore the potential of silkscreen as a fine arts medium. Okay, let's go over to America. So this is Jasper Johns. Jasper Johns is still alive. He's still with us. He was born in 1930. He's 90 years old. He splits his time between his beautiful, architecturally significant home in Connecticut and the island of St. Martin, so he is doing okay. Johns was pivotal to the development of American pop art. He was super important. So he grew up in the South. I think he's originally born in Georgia. He grows up spending a lot of time in South Carolina. And his family, he spends a lot of time living with his grandparents. And no one in his family is very artistically engaged. So when he talks about his childhood, he talks about not really even being aware of art. He says there were no artists around, there was no art around. I didn't really know what that was when he talks about his childhood. He moves to New York City in 1948, and he briefly studies at the Parsons School of Design in New York. He then joins the military, and he's stationed in, I think in Japan during the Korean War. Did I write it down? Yes, he's stationed in Japan during the Korean War. He returns to New York City in 1954, and that is when he meets his longtime lover, sometimes collaborator, and kind of best friend, Robert Rauschenberg. And they're both super important to pop art and to the history of art in general. And they're both very influenced by John Cage. John Cage is a experimental composer. We're going to talk about him in contemporary art when I talk about Fluxus. But just know that John Cage is an important influence on both Johns and Rauschenberg. Okay, so Johns wanted to draw attention to common objects, which as I've already kind of talked about, is one of the main aspects of pop art. So he called these objects, when he's talking about them and why he wants them as subjects, he calls these common objects things that were seen but not looked at. So things that were very pervasive, were around us all the time, just common, normal things that we would look at, see them a million times a day, but we'd never really look at them. So he was interested in drawing focused attention to these kind of things. He tended to paint in series, so he'd paint a series of the same thing, a variance on the same thing over and over again. And he'd focus on a common thing in each one. So this is from a series of paintings he did about the flag, the American flag. He also did a series of paintings with targets. He did several series with targets. He did one with maps of the United States. He did one with alphabets. He did one with numbers. So paintings like this one, which is called Three Flags, initially earned him the label neo-Dadaist. So when he comes on the scene, people don't really know what to make of this, and they're like, well, it's kind of weird, it's maybe subversive, we can't quite tell. It's taking an object. Marcel Duchamp would take actual objects. He was a Dadaist. We're going to call this neo-Dada. So people didn't quite know what to do with him at first. He's also compared pretty often to surrealist Rene Magritte, who I didn't talk about with you specifically because I think his work is boring compared to most of surrealism. But Rene Magritte is quite famous. He does the guy in the bowler hat with the apple in front of his face, you've maybe seen. He also does the work that is a painting of a pipe that says "Ce n'est pas un pipe," which means this is not a pipe. So it's a painting of a pipe that says it's not a pipe, drawing your attention to the fact that it is, in fact, a painting, not an actual pipe. Okay, so because this is a painting of a flag, some comparisons are drawn there with surrealist Rene Magritte. Okay, so an interesting thing about this work, so this is 3 canvases that are attached to each other. It's not flat, they come out toward you. And one of the interesting things about this is because it extends out into the viewer's space, he kind of has a reversal of the expected perspective, right? So we expect for things to be further away when they're smaller. That's how linear perspective works. But in this, the smallest flag is closest to us. So it's this weird kind of flip of expectations, basically. He also kind of drains the meaning out of the objects he paints over and over and over again, because you just keep seeing a flag, keep seeing a flag, keep seeing a flag until it doesn't mean anything anymore, right? It's just kind of devoid of meaning. And he does that a lot. He uses repetitive pattern, and a lot of the pop art people use repetitive pattern to kind of destroy the meaning of objects because you just see them so many times. On this, another thing, and this is another work that seeing these things as slides instead of seeing them in person, it is not the same. The surface texture here is has a lot of connection to gestural abstractionist. So this is painted in encaustic. If you've had Art History 1, we talk about what encaustic is. So encaustic is when you take the pigment, the thing that gives color to paint, but instead of putting it in a carrier like oil or like acrylic or like water for watercolor, you put it in wax. So it's put in hot wax, and then you paint with it. And so it makes this very painterly, very heavy, thick kind of texture. So in that way, the textural look of this thing has a connection to like Willem de Kooning, for example, to his paintings that have the really thick impasto gestural kind of brushwork. So it has a visual connection to the other big movement that's happening right now, which is abstract expressionism, even though pop art and abstract expressionism kind of directly butt heads. So he's aware of that, and he's kind of tying in that connection to draw that kind of comparison. Okay, so the texture reinforces to the viewer that they are looking at a handmade painting of a flag, not a machine-made fabric flag, right? So this is not a pipe thing again. This is something that was made with my hands. I painted it. It's not actually a fabricated flag. Okay, so that's the other kind of purpose of that texture. Okay, let's look at his longtime lover and bestie, Robert Rauschenberg. my favorite artist from this time period. Robert Rauschenberg was born in 1925. He dies in 2008. One of my favorite shows that I saw while I was living in the Bay Area in California was the Robert Rauschenberg retrospective at the SF MoMA at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It's incredible. He was super prolific. He made so much work and so many different kinds of work. Just an incredible variety of techniques and of like really incredible. If you have a chance, Google the SF MoMA Robert Rauschenberg show from like, I think it was in 2017 or 18 maybe. It was a great show. Very cool. Okay. So, Robert Rauschenberg. He was in the military, like Johns. He subsequently studied at the Kansas City Art Institute right here in Missouri. He's there in 1945. He then goes to the Académie Julian in Paris, as have several of the artists we've talked about this semester. And then he eventually goes to Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which is another college that a lot of the modernist, particularly painters, have a connection to. Joseph Albers taught there. He's a color theorist who was pretty important. His wife was Annie Albers, who was an important textile and fibers artist. Okay. So, Rauschenberg uses mass media images directly in his work. So, you can kind of see here, he would cut images directly out of newspapers and magazines and collage them right into the work. He would also cut out things that were like textbook definitions of art movements and paste them directly in there. This one has a catalog description that has to do with abstract expressionism pasted into it, for example. He also made works like this that he called combines. So these basically intersperse painting, collage, and then sculptural elements, found object sculptural elements. So it's kind of like assemblage, but with a painting component. And he used the word combines, and that's what he is most famous and most known for, is his invention of this technique that he called combines. Sometimes they also had kinetic sculptural components. So there's a few that involve light bulbs, and the light would like come on and then go off and come on and then go off. Sometimes there's little moving parts. He did this big sculptural installation that pumped different colored mud that was really wild looking, and he had some that were just mechanical things that would move that were kinetic sculptures that he made at this time. As I said, he did a wide variety of things. One of his more famous combines has, so it has the painting. He's painted on kind of a platform that's on the floor, and then it has a sheep in the middle of it, a sheep with horns, and the sheep has a tire around it, and that's all painted too. It's delightful. Anyway, combines are one of the things he's doing. In the 60s, the 1960s, he starts working with screen printing, with silk screen, like the British guys were doing. And that becomes a big part of his work for the rest of his career. So he, at first, is silk screening in black and white. He has a lot of works where he's silk screening this famous image of JFK, the President, John F. Kennedy. So he's silk screening his face, and then like the rocket launch, the Apollo launch to go to the moon, like images from that are silk screened. So he starts doing that in black and white, then eventually starts incorporating color. But silk screening definitely becomes a big tool that he uses quite a lot in his work from the 60s on. His surfaces also, you can, and again, all of these things are better in person, but you can see if you look in here the way that he's applying paint on top of the collaged surface. It's very thick. It's impasto. It's very painterly. So it's oil paint. It's not encaustics like Jasper Johns, but it has that thick, heavy texture that has a connection to painterly abstractionists like de Kooning, for example, Grace Hardigan, those kind of people. The other thing that is really interesting about Rauschenberg's work, particularly about his combines, is the label information becomes kind of part of the work, okay? So if you look at this, you can see this super long list of materials. And the materials list for these things is always very extensive. It's never just mixed media. He lists out everything that's in there. And that, in a way, kind of becomes part of the artwork, like claiming all of these common objects that are being combined together to make the work. So that's another thing that he's kind of one of the first people to do. Okay. This is another famous guy from pop art. This is Roy Lichtenstein. He's born in 1923 and he dies in 1997. And his work is based a little more in parody. This is kind of all he does. So he has some sculptural things, but they're very much like this. They're based on this kind of idea. They have one of his sculptures at the Springfield Art Museum here in town. I don't think it's out right now. Anyway, so his work's based more in parody, and of his work, he said, we'll just get a quote directly from him. He says, "Pop art is the use of commercial art as subject matter in painting. Everybody calls pop art American painting, but it's actually industrial painting. I think the meaning of my work is that it's industrial. It's what all the world will soon become." So he just takes stills from comics and enlarges them and does them in paint, or he makes up comic strip like material that isn't actually from a comic strip. So it's kind of playing with this idea of a false reality. They're often kind of pessimistic. They're kind of misogynistic, a lot of them, in my opinion. So this is what he does, and he's quite famous, very recognizable, very prolific. Another artist who's very associated with American pop. Okay, Andy Warhol. He's born in 1928. He dies in 1987. So Andy Warhol, when most people think of pop art, you think of Andy Warhol. When a lot of people think of American art, you think of Andy Warhol. You either think of Andy Warhol or Jackson Pollock. Those are probably the two most famous American artists. Okay, so, oh, this is interesting. So I don't know if you guys know this. Do you know that Springfield, Missouri, our very own Springfield Art Museum, has a connection to Andy Warhol and the legacy of Andy Warhol? Okay, this is, if we were actually in class and this wasn't virtual, I would pause to see if anyone knew this story, so. Okay, a few years ago, I think it was 2016. So the Springfield Art Museum hosts this show, and it's British and American pop art. And it's this kind of big deal show that they brought in. It's pretty cool. I went to the opening. Kathleen Turner was one of the underwriters for it. So for this show, they get a lot of really great British pop art, which I hadn't seen a lot of it before, so that was pretty rad. And then they also have a bunch of Warhols. They have a bunch of his famous, iconic Campbell's soup can prints. So the reason, just having a show here doesn't really make us a big connection, but the reason we're part of Andy Warhol's story permanently now, little old Springfield, Missouri Art Museum, is because 7 of those were stolen from our art museum. So someone broke into the museum and stole 7 Andy Warhol Campbell's soup can prints from Springfield, Missouri. So Interpol had to come in, whole thing. They did not find them. They don't know what happened to them. So that is, we are part of an art heist connected to Andy Warhol. So good job, Springfield. Always in the news for the best reasons. Shake my head, disappointed. But it was a really cool show. So, okay, let's talk about Andy Warhol. There's so much to say about Andy Warhol. I mean, he's one of those figures of art that was kind of a giant of art and did a lot of different things. One book that I would recommend if you want an interesting perspective is the book Edie. I think it's called Edie, an American Girl. And it is the biography of Edie Sedgwick. It's written by Jean Stein, Edie by Jean Stein. It's a great book, super fascinating. Edie Sedgwick was one of his factory girls. So we'll talk about his studio was called The Factory, and there were a lot of people associated with The Factory, a subset of which were called the Factory Girls, which these were women who, some of them were artists and some of them were model types and some of them were just people who kind of were society types who just hung out at Andy Warhol's The Factory. Prime among these was Edie Sedgwick. She was kind of the queen of the Factory Girls. and she has connections to all kinds of other people. She dated Bob Dylan. She's got all this. She's a very fascinating and tragic figure. So a book about her is it's really well done, and it's a very interesting kind of perspective on Warhol's The Factory. Okay, anyway. He made a lot of different kinds of work. He made visual arts work like this. He also made a lot of films. His films are pretty famous. A lot of his quotes have become kind of famous to the point where they're part of everyday vernacular. The saying, 15 minutes of fame, that comes from Andy Warhol. He has a quote where he says that, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's basically that he believes in the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. That's where the phrase 15 minutes of fame comes from. So things like that. He kind of is an interesting phenomenon because he made pop art, but he really made himself and his life and the things he said pop art. He made himself kind of a part of pop art. He became the icon, basically. So his whole life was almost like performance art. Okay, so the thing he is maybe the best known for are paintings like this one. So this is where he picks an icon, an icon of mass production that's associated with American mass production and culture, and then he produces it as an artwork over and over again. So, like, for example, here we have Coke. He also did the Campbell's soup can. He also does the Brillo box. He does different kinds of things like this. So he produces it over and over. He does the same thing with celebrity icons. So we have commercial object icons like Coca-Cola, and then we also have celebrity icons like Elizabeth Taylor, like Marilyn Monroe, like Elvis, that he makes portraits of and repeats them over and over. Okay. He favors subjects that are reassuringly familiar, and that's very intentional and is part of his strategy. And here's what he says about the Coke bottle. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see a Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke. And that is essentially what pop art is all about. It's a kind of a democratizing movement, and it's about the similarities in the high and low, and elevating the low and lowering the high until everything's on kind of the same playing field. Here he silkscreens the image over and over again, and then he goes back in with oil paint and slightly alters each of them so they are slightly different. It isn't an accident that he named his studio The Factory. He's very much interested in ideas about mass production and about the effect of mass production and industrialization on culture. He's a fascinating person. We could look at lots of his work and talk about him kind of ad nauseum. I'm not going to do that. I do also like to talk about this other aspect of his life. So he was shot in 1968. Valerie Solanas shoots him. He does not die. He almost dies. They have to resuscitate him. And she is someone who she was associated with the factory. She was one of the people who was hanging out at the factory. She was in one of his films, actually in the same year she shot him. She was in the 1968 Warhol film, I, A Man. And she is known for, she wrote screenplays, and she gave him one of his screenplays, and then he lost it. He didn't give it back to her, and that's kind of why she shot him. She wrote a manifesto called Scum. Scum stands for Society for Cutting Up Men. She was kind of a militant feminist, and one of the reasons also that she shot Andy Warhol was to bring attention to her and her cause. So she's kind of part of the story too. There's a movie called I Shot Andy Warhol. There's several movies about his life that are pretty interesting. So, Andy Warhol. Okay. This is Marisol, one name. She's born in 1930. She dies in 2016. And she is not as much a straight up pop artist as the people we've previously looked at, but I like to include her here because she was in the scene with Warhol and all these guys, was making work at the same time, and was interested in some of the same kinds of things and some of the same kind of methods. You can see in this gallery shot, the piece I just showed you is on the wall behind, and then we have Jasper Johns' flag back there. So she's kind of like in with them, and I think it makes sense to talk about her with the pop artists. So she's a French sculptor. She's of Venezuelan heritage, but she lives and works in New York City for her entire career, basically. And her work kind of toys with prescribed gender and social roles in post-war America. In her work, she poses a parody of women, of fashion, of television, with the goal of igniting social change. So she's looking at advertising and looking at cultural icons, but she's looking at them as gendered items and as what kind of message they're sending about social roles. So this work, Women and Dog, mimics the role of femininity, and it presents kind of it's like a satirical kind of critical response to basically this guise of fabricated femininity that's sort of put out in the advertising and in the commercial world. And it does that by deliberately assuming the role of femininity in order to kind of change its oppressive value and challenge that value. She's mimicking not only the imaginary construct of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a woman as a commodity and as someone to sell to and advertise to by constructing this identity that you maybe don't even want and then selling it back to you. But it's also talking kind of about what it means to be an artist. And she accomplishes this through combining a couple of different things, sensibilities from both pop art, this kind of cool, detached, sort of flat feeling, and also ideas about more expressive tendencies and this painterly quality. So she makes these flat representations of women, and then she paints kind of with impasto technique on top of them. She questions authenticity, not of commercial products, not of like Coke and Campbell's soup, but she questions the authenticity of the constructed self and the societal projection of gender and social norms and social roles. And so she makes these figures that are clearly flat constructed things, right? They're not all the way carved out, but then they have more three-dimensional areas and they're sort of multifaceted. She also sometimes pastes images directly from advertising onto them. She paints on them. She includes real objects like the leash, the dog collar, the bag, the head of the dog. So she's playing with ideas about reality and the way identity is constructed. And it brings in, it wouldn't have worked as well as it did if it wasn't during the conversation about pop art and what was happening with pop. So I think it kind of makes sense to talk about her here. Claus Oldenburg, he is still alive. He was born in 1929. His dad was a Swedish ambassador or worked for the Swedish ambassador or something. Okay, so he's also kind of incisively commenting on American consumer culture. So not just mimicking this consumer culture and talking about like the high-low aspects of art, but he's pretty critical of it. He went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, then he goes to graduate school at Yale. He then moves to New York City in 1956. So a lot of his work before he starts making things that are like hard outdoor public sculptures, his work that's kind of his breakout work that he becomes known and famous for are these oversized, soft sculptures. And he directly steals that idea. So he gets credited with this idea, and it's not his idea. He rips it off and starts doing that. He first was making work that was, he'd take chicken wire and then cover it in cloth and then paint it with house paint and make these things. And then he goes to an exhibition of work by a little-known artist of the time, Yayoi Kusama. who's making soft sculptural pieces, and immediately after that show, he starts making large-scale soft sculpture pieces. His first wife, who he was married to at the time, I wrote her name down, Patty Muka, sews all of these for him. He doesn't know how to sew, even though he's doing soft sculpture. And Yayoi Kusama, goes to his opening when he has all these soft sculptures and is standing there, and Patty, Claes Oldenburg's wife, goes up to her and apologizes and says, I know that this is your thing and he's ripped you off, and then he becomes very famous, and she's not famous for much later. We're going to talk about her in contemporary art when we talk about installation work. Anyway, so he starts off with soft sculpture, and then he moves in. He also starts doing things that are happenings. We've kind of talked about happenings. We're going to talk about them more with performance art. But basically, he had kind of in these happenings that he would stage, they had kind of a pervasive, brash and humorous kind of tone, which was sort of at odds and clashed with the seriousness of, say, abstract expressionism and what was going on with that kind of work. In 1963, he moves to LA because he wanted to get far away from New York. He was tired of the New York art scene. He eventually moves back to New York City, and he still works and lives there today. He's best known for his large-scale outdoor sculptures like this one. This was originally installed at Yale, and it was his first large-scale public sculpture. It was made in protest of the Vietnam War and was installed on May 15th, 1969. And so, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's a lipstick on a tank, so it's talking about, it's supposed to look phallic, and it's kind of, originally the top part of the lipstick would inflate and then go down, and then you'd have to crank it up to inflate it. So basically, it's using this feminine cosmetic product as a stand-in for male genitalia on a tank, so it's talking kind of about the impotency and ridiculousness of the Vietnam War. So after this first piece, he starts doing lots of large-scale sculpture, that's displayed outside, this public sculpture, and it's always like, this is kind of a combination of multiple things. Most of his work that he's known for is just taking an ordinary object, like something that Jasper Johns would focus on, and then blowing it up huge. And that's what he becomes more known for. So here in Missouri, you can go up to the wonderful Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City and see his Shuttlecocks, which are on the lawn. There's two on one side and one on the other, of the Nelson Atkins. That's the same sculpture garden that has all the wonderful Henry Moore sculptures that I told you about. And these, later in his career, he makes work in partnership with his wife, his second wife, Kusi van Bruggen, and actually credits her for the work that she does on these. So maybe he learned and grew. Okay, so that's Claes Oldenburg. JeanMichel Basquiat is an artist that he's born in 1960. He dies tragically young in 1988. He's really someone who's more of a neo-expressionist, and he's someone that I will talk about more when I talk about the subsets of postmodernism and contemporary art. But I can't talk about pop art without mentioning him because he had such a strong connection to Andy Warhol. So this is him with Andy Warhol, and this is the painting he did of them together. So I just like to mention him briefly in connection with pop art, and then I'll talk about him a little more with neo-expressionism. But basically, they collaborated on a lot of things. He was living on the street, he was schizophrenic and homeless, and he was doing graffiti work in New York, and Andy Warhol meets him and thinks he's incredibly talented and brings him into the factory, and they collaborate on work together. So like Warhol screen prints things like the beef rib steaks, rib roast, that kind of thing, and then Basquiat paints over it, or the opposite, Basquiat does a painting and Warhol screen prints on it. They did a lot of collaborative work together, and they were very close. So I think basically I just feel like I have to mention him because he's a wonderful artist. He's one of my favorite artists from the 80s, and he does have this strong connection to pop art, though he really, as I said, his own work is more neo-expressionist. So we'll talk about him more later, but Basquiat is important and cool and exists. Okay. The last artist I'm going to talk to you about is an artist that is not often put in with the pop artists, but I think that's kind of where she belongs. Actually, she's just not a huge... I didn't learn about her until I was in graduate school and actually wrote a paper about her. But this is Niki de Saintoc. She's born in 1930. She dies in 2002. She's a super fascinating figure. She had a horribly tragic life, as so many of these poor artists do. Very rough childhood. But basically, the reason I put her here is I think that she's a good bridge between pop art and going into postmodernism, particularly going into ideas about performance art and interactive media. So she's French. Very French name. She's French. And she is in New York, and she falls in with Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg. They were very close. They were good buddies. And John Cage. So, as I said, we'll talk about John Cage when we talk about Fluxus. But so John Cage is a big influence on all of them and has kind of his little group of artists. Yoko Ono was another big Fluxus artist who was in with John Cage. So Niki de Saintoc, comes up with this idea called tirs, T-I-R-S, which is the French word meaning like shot, like you shoot a gun. Okay? And so she comes up with these paintings called terse paintings, and she paints them from 1961 to 1963 or 4. And basically, she makes these things, and it's hard to see in this slide, but she'll take a board, and she puts all these found objects on it, kind of like a Louise Nevelson, when we looked at her in post-minimalism. So she has all these common objects, she paints everything white, and she has balloons or bags full of bright colors of paint, usually primary colors, embedded. And then she kind of paints over that. So it looks like it's all part of this monotone white relief sculpture. Then, at the happening, at the event, originally she used darts, and she'd invite people from the audience to throw darts to eventually hit the balloons and burst them. Then she starts using guns. So she takes out a gun and starts shooting the painting, and the shots to the painting burst the paint balls, the paint balloons underneath, and so the painting is completed in this manner. She would also have other artists like Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg shoot at them with her. So she and Rauschenberg have kind of a lot in common, because she's basically making combines, but the painterly part of it doesn't happen until the action is applied, until you shoot them. So it's also kind of a riff on action painting as well. They're super interesting works. So one of the famous ones is from, she's at the American Embassy in Paris, and she and Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg are up on stage making work, and they're making work while another artist whose name I am blanking on is playing a John Cage composition. And so John Cage orchestrated the whole thing, and they're performing their art. So she's shooting her painting, and they're making work on stage together. And that was called Variations 2. That was the name of that happening. I think that was in 1964. So she's kind of using the idea of ready-made, she's using the idea of action painting, she's using the idea of audience participation, like the thing being completed with the audience in front of the audience. So she's combining a lot of the things that we've looked at as parts of the American avant-garde up to this point all into one thing. The last ones of these that were created were smaller scale, and she made them and sent them off to people, so then you complete them at home, like you would throw things at them or shoot them at home to complete the paintings. So then she's also bringing in this idea of art through the mail. So she really was exploring and doing a lot of really cutting edge, interesting things, and combining a lot of different things to create something totally new. And I think she's pretty interesting and kind of fits with pop, kind of fits in with performance art. For the rest of her career, she goes in a totally different direction and makes these very large-scale, voluptuous, brightly colored statues of women she calls nanas, which are totally different from this, and in my opinion, aren't as interesting, but they also sort of could fit in with pop art. So she's an interesting figure, and I thought we would end here. The last thing I'm going to do is put up a video that just kind of goes through contemporary art, as much as I can. And then since we're getting close to the end of the semester, I'll create videos that go more in depth with different fields in contemporary art and post them later. But okay.